Broadband connectivity will spur growth in African economies over the next decade, but there is still plenty of work to be done in building the telecommunications infrastructure that will connect the continent to the global village. In studio with me to discuss this further, I have Mark Simpson, Chief Executive Officer at SEACOM. Mark, a very warm welcome to you.
Thanks, Natasha.
Let's start with the relationship between broadband and the economy. Now, according to one World Bank study, for every 10% of broadband connectivity, the GDP is set to grow by 1.3%.
Yep.
As a network provider on the African continent, have you seen that reflective in the African countries you operate in?
I think we've certainly seen that as SEACOM arrived back in 2009 and other cables since then, and we've started to open up some of that availability, certainly not to the level we'd all want to yet. We've seen a lot of growth in the ICT sector of the economies, and we're certainly seeing that coming through. Certainly talking to a lot of the governments of Africa too. They're expecting to see the same thing and making plans to be ready for that.
Now you're saying we're not at the levels we want to be. We know we're nowhere near the levels of Europe and
Sure.
the Americas. What's keeping us back?
Well, look, I think we're just at a different stage of development, so we started a little bit later. At the moment, we're certainly seeing probably enough of the basic fibre infrastructure coming in at an international level. The challenge now is getting that inland, getting it from the beaches into the cities, getting it into the customers' homes. And of course, Africa has some special challenges being of the geography that it is.
Speaking of that last mile connectivity, the backhaul connectivity, are African countries and governments coming to the fore and saying we will invest, that it's here, we see the value in putting the infrastructure in place?
I think the model's probably different in many different places. Obviously, the first thing that governments can do, I think, is to recognise that the regulatory framework needs to be fairly open. They need to look at their existing assets that they themselves have got and see what can be done to utilise those best. In some cases, some governments will invest, in others they will look to probably create public-private partnerships and encourage others to come in and invest. So it's going to be a mixed model. Speaking
of that regulatory framework, we know some African countries are more challenging than others, a lot of red tape, a lot of bureaucracy. As a fibre provider, network provider, how do you deal with all of that and trying to make people understand the business and the value of the investment?
I think we just spend a lot of time talking. We can use a lot of models from around the world, obviously, to show the advantage that's been achieved. There's obviously quite often the governments have been the primary investor and the benefit of the existing infrastructure and running the local telcos. So helping them to understand that the overall returns can be much greater if you open up, if you enable quite a bit more freedom in the network and competition, then we try to do that as much as possible.
Let's look at mobile penetration in Africa. Exorbitant rates.
Much higher than we see elsewhere, not only in terms of at this stage of development, but I think also in terms of the amount of bandwidth that's going onto those mobile devices. So we're seeing probably penetration of about 20% of broadband connectivity being done through mobile devices. That will continue to be the way of it.
And it's growing like crazy, but do we have the infrastructure in place, or are we going to meet that demand?
I think we'll meet the demand, probably not as quickly as the users might like to see it happening. But I expect that we're seeing development at the moment where people have moved away from the mobile companies have moved away from the need to own the tower networks. They're willing to share those. We're now seeing fibre coming in between and connecting up all those towers. That's great. We're starting to see in certain countries moves by the regulators to free up the spectrum that's necessary for not only 3G but also 4G and LTE.
Yeah.
And that will enable a lot more. And the challenging thing is whether the content can keep pace with the way we roll the networks out. But certainly we expect that on the mobile side, that's where a lot of the access is going to come, because the physical build of fibre across so much of the geography is going to lag for a while yet.
Now, speaking of keeping up with the times, since SEACOM launched and landed in July 2009, how has the progress been, and what is the progress going forward, on the short term at least?
Well, I think very much our initial focus was obviously get the cable landed, make that capacity available. The team that achieved that did some wonderful things in such a short period of time. In less than 3 years, we basically went from concept to landing and lighting the cable. That has driven an enormous amount of change. It's forced others to change as well. and we're very happy to have been a disruptor in that regard. We want to continue to be a disruptor. One of the things we want to do is to ensure that the African internet grows. Not just that connectivity from a particular customer to content that's in London or in the US is enabled, but that content starts to come closer to them, that we see the content being much more about Africa and African specific needs, and that basically the ICT growth here is around building African content, enabling people to build their own businesses, to create content that's very specific. And there's an enormous amount of content, of course, that's very specific to Africa, not only from a language but from a cultural perspective. If we look at somewhere like Nigeria and the film industry there, of course, the content is there. Making it available and accessible for people is going to be probably the next challenge. We look forward to participating in that.
Well, we look forward into monitoring your progress in that regard. Mark, thank you very much.